can they combine and receive light or cast shadows? When the sun rises and illuminates something like a pillar, the east side and the west side are illuminated and shaded respectively. Since the side that receives light and the side that is shaded are not identical, the atoms are established as being extended. Also, when you see or touch something such as a wall, you can only see one side and not the other. Since the wall and the atoms are identical, the atoms must be extended. Also, wherever there are atoms, they must have such differences as being above or below, or in one of the four directions. If this is not so, it cannot be said that they gather together and combine. Otherwise, if they interpenetrate, they do not form as a larger mass and become gross form. Therefore, atoms definitely have extension. If it is claimed that resistant form is identical with atoms, then if atoms are not extended, form will not obstruct or separate things. In this case, it is neither obstructive nor resistant. Therefore, the atoms clung to by these schools must have extension, and since they are extended, they are divisible and therefore not real. Therefore, the reality of resistant form is inadmissible.
How can the 5 kinds of consciousness, visual, auditory, olfactory, etc., not have material, supports or form as objects? It is just that they are not lacking in form as a support, but that this form is a transformation of consciousness. That is, when consciousness arises, through the power of internal causes, it transforms and appears as images, such as eyes, etc., and external forms, etc., and on the basis of these images there is a support, which is the organ, and an object, which is the apparent external form, for the senses. However, the visual faculty, etc., are not known by direct perception. They are inferred by their ability to produce consciousness. They are only powers, not something produced externally, apart from consciousness. An external resistant form is inadmissible, and therefore it must be the mere transformation and appearance of internal consciousness. When it appears as visual consciousness, for example, it is called the visual faculty, because it is the support that generates visual consciousness. An external condition as object, external to visual consciousness, is inadmissible, and therefore it must be granted that the condition as object is the transformation of one's consciousness.
It is said by the small vehicle that that which generates consciousness similar to itself is a condition in the form of an object, alambana pratyaya. We reply that his condition in the form of object alone cannot generate consciousness, because it must not be that conditions as cause, hichu pratyaya, etc., are to be called condition in the form of object, since they produce consciousness. The Sautrantikas claim that, when the 5 forms of consciousness, such as visual consciousness, etc., perceive a color, etc., they have as their object nothing but aggregates of atoms, because they are similar to the image. But the image of the aggregation, being different from the atoms themselves, has no real substance, because when the aggregation is divided, a consciousness similar to the image definitely does not arise. Since the image of this aggregation is not real, it cannot be claimed that it is the condition for the 5 kinds of consciousness, because something illusory, like a second moon, cannot generate the 5 kinds of consciousness. Nor, according to another school of the small vehicle, do all the atoms combine and thus become the condition as object for the arising of each of the 5 kinds of consciousness, because in that case there is no image of atoms in consciousness. Atoms do not have the characteristic of the aggregation, because when they are uncombined, that characteristic does not exist. Nor either combined or uncombined, do the substance and characteristics of atoms have any difference, and therefore just as in an uncombined state, the atoms of form, etc., when combined, are not the object of the 5 consciousnesses.
There is a theory that individual atoms of form, etc., are not the object of consciousness in an uncombined state, but when combined they evolve and assist each other to produce gross form, and this is the object of consciousness. That form is real and is the object of consciousness. But this is not so, because whether combined or uncombined, atoms retain the same substance and characteristics, and so, since the atoms of, say, a pot or a bowl are the same, there would be no difference when consciousness has them as objects. Also, in a state of combination, each atom loses its characteristics of minuteness and roundness. Nor can consciousness of gross form take as an object smaller forms, because it must not be that a certain consciousness can have as an object the object of another consciousness, and because in that case one kind of consciousness must take as its object that of another consciousness. Even admitting the existence of atoms, these errors persist. How much less are there any atoms external to consciousness? Consequently, we definitely know that images resembling form, etc., which are transformations of consciousness, are the condition as object for consciousness, because the seeing part of consciousness is generated thanks to that image and incorporates it as its own object. When consciousness evolves, it suddenly produces a single image that may be large or small, but it does not evolve in parts to form a multiplicity of atoms that then combine into an object. Now, a doctrine of Buddhism states that gross form is not a real object. The reason the Buddha spoke of atoms was so that people would reject the notion. He did not mean that form is composed of real atoms.
The yoga masters, relying on conventional thought and wisdom, divide forms of gross matter progressively to the point where it is no longer divisible and conventionally designate what remains as atoms. These atoms are said to be extended but no longer divisible. If they were again divided, atoms would resemble space and could no longer be called form. They therefore say that atoms are the limit of form. As a result of this, you should realize that resistant forms appear from the transformation of consciousness and are not composed of atoms. Form that is not resistant is like resistant form and is not real. Or being like mind and its activities, it is not real form. We must conclude on the basis of reason that resistant form that manifests the characteristics of real form does not exist apart from consciousness. How much less can non-resistant form, not having the characteristics of form, be said to be real form?
5e indicative and non-indicative form. Do not indicative form, vichvaptirapa, and non-indicative form, avichvaptiripa, really exist? No, they do not really exist. Why? If we grant that bodily indicative form really exists, what is its nature? If you say that it is form, then it does not exist, because, as form, it is divisible, and atoms of length, etc., are not perceptible. If you say that its nature is movement, it again does not exist, because it perishes as soon as it arises and thus does not actually move, and because conditioned dharmas perish without need of a cause, because if perishing required a cause, it would not be perishing. If it is claimed that there is form that is neither evident nor corporeal and is generated by mental activity to move hands, etc., and that this is what is meant by indicative bodily form, this is not reasonable. If it is movement, we have already rejected that previously. If it is the cause of movement, then it would resemble the element of wind, which is responsible for movement, but wind does not indicate, so it cannot be said to indicate. What is more, physical contact is neither good nor bad by nature, and thus cannot indicate. The same is true of color, smell, and taste, and therefore bodily indicative acts do not exist.
With mind as cause, an image of form, such as a hand, etc., which has evolved from consciousness, is born and perishes in a continuous series and changes locations as if it really moved. The form of the hand actually indicates mind, as its cause, and is therefore metaphorically designated as bodily indication. Vocal indication does not have the nature of real sound, because sound during an instant does not indicate anything. Also, sound in a continuous series of instants is not real. Also, the reality of external resistant form has already been refuted. However, with mind as cause, something resembling sound evolves from consciousness, appears and disappears in a continuous series, and seems to indicate or inform, and for this reason it is metaphorically designated as vocal indication, without violating reason. Now, if indication is not real, how can non-indication be real? However, vows or intentions of good and bad for a certain time could be metaphorically established as being non-indication, with no violation of reason. This means that it metaphorically exists in a situation in which seeds of good or bad volitions increase and grow on the basis of the